wait. We have thousands of stories talking about it.
Sure.
And we have documentaries, we have news stories, and that. Is Natalie here, somebody here to turn that? I could show you a couple of things, and it has to be responded to.
Yeah, sure.
Trump just stood in the Oval Office and accused black South Africans of white genocide, while President Ramaphosa sat across from him stunned. Fake videos, twisted history, and a lie powerful enough to shake the entire continent. Was this just another Trump outburst, or a deliberate attempt to rewrite Africa's past? Let's find out. The room was elegant, the cameras were ready, and history was watching. When South African President Cyril Ramaphosa sat across from Donald Trump at the White House, there was no sign that the meeting would become a geopolitical fault line. On paper, it was a standard diplomatic engagement. But as the microphones picked up Trump's voice, the atmosphere shifted. With a casual tone that belied the weight of what he was about to say, Trump uttered a sentence that cracked through the room like glass. "We're concerned about what's happening to the white farmers in South Africa." Silence followed, but not the respectful kind. It was the kind that happens when someone says the unspeakable in a place where truth is supposed to live. This wasn't just a political blunder or some badly worded concern. This was a revival of a toxic myth, one that's long been circulated in alt-right circles and white nationalist forums, that black South Africans, having reclaimed their land and power after apartheid, are now seeking revenge, that they're committing a hidden genocide, one that the mainstream media is too afraid to report. But it wasn't true, and Trump knew, or should have known, that it wasn't true. The numbers, reported by both South African authorities and independent watchdogs, paint a very different picture. Farmers, black and white, have faced rural violence, yes, but there is no orchestrated racial campaign to exterminate white people in South Africa. The entire narrative has been manufactured and then aggressively exported through a pipeline of digital manipulation. And that's what made Trump's words so explosive. He wasn't asking a question. He wasn't citing a study. He was amplifying a fiction, and doing it in the most powerful office in the world. Even more chilling was the way the claim was backed. Trump's team circulated supporting material through media briefings and anonymous online accounts. Graphic videos, violent imagery, headlines in all caps. But behind the visuals was a dirty secret. Many of the clips weren't even from South Africa. Some came from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Others were unrelated crime footage repurposed to match a racial narrative. What Trump had done was not just spread misinformation. He had elevated a foreign disinformation tactic, usually reserved for shadowy regimes, and brought it to the center of Western diplomacy. And he had aimed it straight at a country still healing from one of the most brutal racial regimes in human history. But perhaps even more calculated was who he was trying to reach. Because Trump's narrative wasn't just designed for domestic consumption, it was a whistle to white conservative audiences both in the US and abroad. People already primed to believe that any push for racial equity is a threat to their existence. By suggesting that white people were now the new victims, Trump inverted the legacy of apartheid, making the oppressor the oppressed and the liberator the villain. And yet, the most alarming detail of all wasn't even the claim. It was the reaction, the absence of outrage. For hours, even days, major Western outlets didn't challenge the narrative. Political commentators danced around it. Some US lawmakers nodded along. It was as though truth had momentarily lost its gravity. Africa noticed, but it didn't react in the old way. There were no tired diplomatic denials, no neatly phrased press releases. Instead, there was a pause, a collective inhale, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak with clarity. That voice came from the West, not the West, but West Africa. From Accra, Ghana, came a thunderclap. A man whose political career had always been defined by cautious statesmanship was about to break character. John Mahama was done enough being diplomatic. But before we hear his voice, we have to ask, why did this lie hurt so deeply? Why was it this moment, this claim, that pierced through decades of silent distortion? Because this wasn't just a political narrative. It was an attempt to rewrite African memory itself. And that's exactly what Mahama would not allow. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When the lie echoed out of Washington, it didn't just wound South Africa, it unsettled every African nation that had ever had its history rewritten by someone else's agenda. And yet, for 48 hours, the air remained still, a dangerous stillness, the kind that usually follows propaganda, so well dressed it passes for fact. But then, from Accra, the silence cracked. Former President John Dramani Mahama didn't hold a press conference. He didn't issue a guarded statement with diplomatic padding. Instead, he launched a literary assault, an opinion article published globally in The Guardian that hit with the precision of a sniper and the force of a storm. This wasn't a comment, it was a reckoning. Mahama opened not by addressing Trump directly, but by addressing Africa's soul. His words didn't read like a political rebuttal. They read like a man cracking open the vault of Africa's memory, a memory that's been looted, redacted, retranslated, and weaponized for centuries. Trump's claim isn't just false, Mahama wrote. It is an insult to every African who lived through colonization and fought through apartheid. And that was the shift. Mahama reframed the debate not as a dispute between two political figures, but as a battle over who gets to define African reality. The myth of white genocide wasn't simply offensive, it was part of a global effort to reverse engineer African liberation into African villainy. Mahama spoke with surgical clarity. He didn't debate crime statistics. He didn't get lured into defending South Africa's internal affairs. Instead, he zoomed out and asked the most dangerous question of all. Why does the West suddenly care about South Africa, only when white people claim to be victims? It wasn't rhetorical, it was an indictment. Mahama reminded the world of something history books often skip: how the West ignored South Africa during apartheid, how US presidents shook hands with apartheid leaders, how Britain condemned sanctions on the regime, how black bodies could be gunned down in Soweto, and no Western capital would blink. But now, decades later, when white farmers allege persecution, suddenly, South Africa is in a crisis. That's not a concern, Mahama implied. That's opportunism. But Mahama didn't stop with exposing double standards. He accused Trump of something far more deliberate: narrative theft, taking Africa's long, bloody struggle for land, dignity, and justice, and flipping it on its head, recasting black resistance as racial aggression. And that's where Mahama struck the deepest chord. For decades, Africa has fought not just for its land, but for the right to tell its own story, to say, we are not savages, we are not chaos, we are not a charity case. And now, just when that voice was beginning to rise, Trump attempted to hijack it again with the same colonial lens. Mahama understood that. He had lived through coups, IMF deals, and Western editorial boards that always seemed more comfortable with African failure than African defiance. And now, he had no patience left. He called out not just Trump, but the global system that amplifies men like him, a media industrial complex that lets lies spread faster than truth, especially when the lies fit old stereotypes. And in doing so, he flipped the script. Suddenly, Trump wasn't the bold truth-teller exposing something the world wouldn't say. He was the latest colonizer of truth, dressed in red, white, and blue, but armed with the same arrogance. Mahama's article went viral. But it wasn't the virality of a trending moment. It was the virality of a pressure valve releasing decades of unspoken rage. African youth shared it like gospel. Commentators called it a diplomatic earthquake. Elders called it long overdue. Some even compared it to Mandela's speeches during apartheid's last days, where the truth was told not as a plea, but as a warning. And perhaps the most remarkable part? Mahama didn't speak for Ghana. He didn't speak for Ramaphosa. He spoke for everyone who still remembers what colonization felt like and refuses to watch it return in digital form. But words alone aren't enough in a world where misinformation travels like wildfire. If a myth can be told through manipulated images, fake statistics, and false concern, what stops it? That's where Mahama turned next. From rage to revelation, from truth-telling to truth-defending. Because the next battle wasn't about who said what. It was about how information had become a weapon, and Africa needed to learn how to fight back. Mahama's thunderous reply didn't just echo across continents, It revealed a terrifying new frontier. The war wasn't being fought with guns or diplomats anymore. It was being waged through pixels, headlines, and misinformation. And while the words may have come from Trump, the weapon itself was far more dangerous than any one man. It was information, distorted, repackaged, and deployed like a missile. Because once Mahama exposed the lie, the question wasn't just why Trump said what he said. It became how the lie was constructed in the first place. And that unraveling pointed not toward ignorance, but design. A few clicks into the videos Trump cited revealed the game. Several clips labeled, "White farmers attacked in South Africa" were lifted from old, unrelated footage. Some from violent protests in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Others from rural disputes entirely unconnected to race. Photos of bloody crime scenes, stripped of their original context, were recycled in alt-right Telegram groups and resurfaced in U.S. congressional briefings without verification. But here's the genius and the danger of misinformation in the 21st century. It doesn't need to be true, it just needs to feel true. And for audiences already conditioned by decades of anti-black propaganda, that feeling is enough. The images flash, the headlines scream, a single tweet ignites a storm, and before the fact-checkers even get out of bed, the lie has sprinted halfway across the planet. This is what Mahama saw coming. He wasn't just worried about Trump's mouth, he was worried about the machine behind it. While Trump fumbled through his claims in front of cameras, an entire network was doing the real work in the shadows. Influencers, bots, anonymous accounts with thousands of followers, all pushing the same line. White people are being killed, and the media is hiding it. And these narratives didn't just stay online. They were picked up by Western columnists, turned into panel discussions, and turned into legislative proposals. U.S. senators began citing farm murders in South Africa as a reason to propose emergency refugee protections, for white farmers only. One right-wing think tank even proposed conditioning aid to South Africa based on the treatment of white landowners. Just like that, a lie born on the internet had climbed its way into global policy rooms. For Mahama and many others watching in Africa, this wasn't a warning, this was a pattern. It was the same strategy used to destabilize Libya before Gaddafi was bombed. The same method is used to justify military presence in the Sahel. First, create a crisis. Then, claim the moral duty to intervene. Only now, the battlefield had moved from jungles and oil fields to narrative warfare. This shift is perhaps the most under-discussed threat facing the global South today. While tanks and sanctions are visible, misinformation is invisible until it's too late. It sows doubt. It weakens trust in governments. It pits citizens against each other. It reframes sovereignty as instability. And what's worse, Africa is often not equipped to defend against it. Most African countries lack the resources, digital infrastructure, or institutional trust to combat disinformation at the scale Western entities produce it. Fact-checking organizations are underfunded. Algorithms often prioritize foreign content over local truth. And colonial languages, English, French, Portuguese, become the very tools through which Africa is manipulated. This is why Mahama's message hit harder than most. Because he wasn't just challenging Trump, he was warning Africans that the war had changed. "We can no longer afford to let others speak for us," he wrote. "In the age of weaponized information, silence is surrender." And so the real danger became clear. If Africa doesn't tell its story, someone else will. And they'll do it not with empathy, but with objectives, not with memory, but with manipulation. But Mahama didn't just ring the alarm, he lit the path forward. His call wasn't to censorship, but to sovereignty over narrative. To invest not just in armies or economies, but in truth infrastructure, independent media, local digital platforms, African-led education systems that teach history as it was, not as it's been marketed. Because this war won't be won with retweets or viral threads. It will be won by Africans recognizing that in the 21st century, telling your truth is no longer enough. You must protect it. And the next question, naturally, was, how do you protect the truth when the entire world is invested in distorting it? That answer, Mahama knew, wouldn't come from fact-checking apps or PR statements. It would come from unity, pan-African, unshakable, unapologetic unity. And that is where he turned next. If information is now the weapon, then unity is the shield. And Mahama knew that truth, no matter how powerful on its own, becomes vulnerable when it stands alone. His words weren't just a defense of South Africa. They were a call to every African nation, movement, and citizen. Don't let this lie isolate one of us, because it's meant to divide all of us. And suddenly, something began to stir across the continent. The idea that seemed for decades to belong only to history books and revolutionary speeches, the dream of Pan-Africanism, started to breathe again. But this wasn't the Pan-Africanism of grand conferences or dusty resolutions. This was different. This was born not from bureaucrats, but from anger, from memory, and from digital rage turned political clarity. A new generation of Africans, born after the Cold War, raised with smartphones and disillusioned by global hypocrisy, heard Mahama's words not as theory, but as a command. An attack on one African country's truth, Mahama had written, is an attack on the entire continent's future. The simplicity of that sentence electrified people across borders. Youth movements from Kenya to Senegal began circulating the quote with hashtags like #AfricaUnites and #TruthIsOurs. Podcasts lit up with conversations about sovereignty and history. For the first time in years, African political discourse was less about elections or donor funding and more about collective dignity. And that shift didn't come from nowhere. The lie Trump pushed didn't just offend, it awakened a long-sleeping resentment. From Accra to Gaborone, from Maputo to Bamako, Africans remembered all the other times foreign powers had tried to divide them under the guise of concern. Rwanda, Sudan, Libya, the Sahel. Always the same pattern. Paint an internal problem as a global threat, then intervene for peace, while extracting resources or installing puppets. Mahama's intervention reminded the continent that this wasn't a South African issue. It was an African one. And not in the abstract. Because if the myth of white genocide could be normalized, what's next? What stops the next Western leader from claiming ethnic cleansing in Namibia, or alleging persecution in Nigeria? What if the next time an African country redistributes land or regulates foreign companies, they're accused of targeting minorities? What if another Mahama dares to reject IMF terms, and is framed as a dictator oppressing democracy? This is why Mahama's tone was so fierce. He wasn't being overdramatic. He was reading the pattern. The lie was never just about South Africa. It was a test. How divided is Africa right now? How fast can one leader be isolated from the others? But this time, the test failed. Because the response was thunderous. The African Union didn't just issue a mild statement. They denounced Trump's claims as inflammatory and contrary to the facts on the ground. The Southern African Development Community, SADC, reaffirmed that South Africa's land reform was a sovereign matter, not an international crisis. Even historically quiet governments like Botswana and Lesotho spoke out, warning against foreign interference disguised as concern. And then came the cultural voices, artists, poets, influencers, authors, turning Mahama's words into music, murals, and manifestos. African identity, once diluted in global media, suddenly surged with force. Not through violence, but through clarity. We are not your crisis. We are your mirror. That was the psychological shift. Mahama had struck the match, but the fire had been waiting. The idea of Pan-Africanism, long reduced to symbolic gestures, had returned as a strategy, not just for dignity, but for survival. And not the survival of borders or economies, but the survival of truth. Because if Africa cannot speak with one voice when its history is under attack, then whose voice will echo when its future is threatened? This then became the new mission, to transform Pan-Africanism from a dream into a defense system. To build networks where lies could be countered before they became global headlines. To create solidarity, not as sentiment, but as policy. Mahama had reminded Africa of its deepest power, its collective memory. And in doing so, he reminded the world that Africa doesn't need saving. It needs to be heard. Do you think Africa needs to stand up against misinformation? Or will Trump's lies overshadow the truth? Let us know in the comment section what needs to be done. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.